Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Today I'd like to talk about the recent history of the National Gallery's Virgin of the Rocks, and that's its restoration about a decade ago, and the important discoveries we made at that time, as well as exciting new information recently uncovered by my colleagues in the scientific department. It's work that informs part of the current exhibition, which I hope you've all seen, and so this is a chance to go a little deeper into that material that lies sort of behind it. The most recent research has been presented in Paris by the Gallery's head of scientific, Marika Spring, and I'm grateful to her and her colleagues Catherine Higgett and Marta Melchiori for allowing me to use some of their amazing images within today's presentation. The new material you'll see within this talk is slides with a lighter gray background, just to be clear about what's new and what's from the time of the restoration. There have been many other treatments and research projects that have taken place in France and Italy since our restoration work, and these and the more recent scientific work, I think, have given us a whole new perspective on the way that our painting came into being. Our restoration campaign took place from late 2008 until the middle of 2010. We did this primarily for aesthetic reasons. The varnish, which had been applied in 1948-49, was of a very unstable composition. It had a mastic resin, which yellows in turpentine with quite a lot of oil, which adds to the yellowing. And then on top of that was a layer of wax as a finish. And here's an image of it from within the gallery. So the varnish had yellowed quite perceptibly, but I wouldn't say disastrously so. But the real problem was the fine cracking in the varnish, the haze, and the dirt which had kind of stuck in the wax coating had really compromised the ability of the varnish to saturate the picture. And that means you couldn't really understand the modeling from light to dark and really see the kind of sculptural quality and the careful manipulation of lighting, which is so central to what the picture is. So if this restoration was mostly about making the picture look better, it also culminated years of study, both of this painting and quite a few paintings within the collection by Leonardo's Milanese associates. We have 20-odd paintings from the Milanese studio in the collection itself. So I'm talking on behalf of loads of colleagues from conservation, curatorial, and scientific departments, and that's talking about work really that took place over years involved in research, analysis, or restoration of paintings that are relevant to thinking about the Virgin of the Rocks. So I've mentioned the work by the scientific department, the new work, but during the time of the treatment itself, it's worth pointing out that my closest collaborator was the painting's curator, an organizer of the gallery's Leonardo at the Court of Milan exhibition, that was Luc Sisson, and I'm drawing heavily on work from Ashok Roy and Rachel Morrison in analysis and layer structures, and I'm similarly indebted to infrared research undertaken by Luc and Rachel Billinge. So the 2008 treatment is the latest in a long series of movements and treatments undertaken since the work was made. The story of the commission, as you know, is a topic in its own right, but I would like to give a bare outline. The painting was commissioned as part of a larger ensemble by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception at San Francesco Grande in 1483, and that probably resulted in the completion of the picture you see here, the one now in the Louvre, which seems not to have been installed, but gone or sold elsewhere. There's a broad consensus that the gallery version was begun in the early to mid-1490s to replace it, and was probably installed unfinished around 1503. Leonardo was away from Milan between 1501 and 1506, and when he got back, it seems like the project was restarted, and the work being considered finished enough to get its final payment 25 years after it started, and one court case in 1508. The National Gallery painting stayed in Milan until 1780, and then it was purchased and brought to England by Gavin Hamilton, who brought quite a lot of important works into Britain. It passed through two more English collections, and then it was acquired by the gallery from the Earl of Suffolk in 1880. And about that time, I'll say a bit about its conservation. The panel was thinned and given the cradle, this kind of support structure, shortly after its acquisition. Now, cradles are often very problematic, but in this case, the panel has remained stable, and the cradle hasn't caused any major structural problems. The painting may have been cleaned a bit at this time, we don't know. There are references to removing some varnish on the surface in connection of dealing with treating the surface for so-called fogging or bloom. But a comprehensive cleaning and restoration didn't happen until Helmut Ruhrmann cleaned the picture in 1948, as I said. Now, here's the varnish that he removed in 1948. He left some dark brown squares on the edges of the painting. There's one of them, you can see. That was a kind of thing at the time to demonstrate, what he'd removed. Those squares that he left, which must be 19th century or older coatings, had mastic, damar, frill balsam, linseed oil, all mixed up. It's a complicated mixture, and it suggests that there were several layers of varnish on the painting at that time. And the bulk of the stuff that Roman removed must have been applied before the gallery acquired the picture, as I said, in 1880. So as we described, Roman's varnish degraded fairly rapidly, but his documentation of the cleaning was very, very thorough for its day, and there are loads of very detailed photographs from that period, and these were very, very helpful in the restoration we did. The treatment also benefited from what was new information at the time with non-invasive imaging methods, such as X-radiography and infrared reflectography and image processing. As you'll see later in this talk, things have moved on quite a bit from 2008, 9, 10, but still, it was very helpful at the time. So here's a conventional X-radiograph showing the cradle, and at the time we were able to digitally remove that cradle and concentrate on seeing the effects of the paint layers on the X-ray. These are just these large format black and white negatives that Roman made, and they're amazing because you can get all sorts of information just by manipulating the contrast. There's loads of information in the lights and the darks, and so they're very, very useful references during our cleaning. And there's just some more ideas about how the comprehensive photography that Roman made was particularly useful in documenting and seeing how the picture looked before and after our treatment by way of reference. The pre-restoration imaging work also provided a major and unexpected discovery, the existence of a wholly different initial composition, one with strong associations with other drawings and paintings from the early 1490s. The infrared reflectography showed a significant part of an image of a kneeling virgin. You can see it's a schematic rendering of that. Her right arm extended, her left hand resting across her breast, as we felt at the time anyway. More on that later. And that's a pose which resonated strongly with a drawing for a nativity or an adoration of the Christ child, which is now in the Met, you see here. And these sketches hadn't been able to be linked to any surviving painting at that time, not by Leonardo anyway. And they link also to a picture in Windsor. Within a sheet of architectural studies, you can see a kneeling virgin leaning forward, one arm back. Now, this first composition underneath the painting you see now began on the panel as a brush drawing directly on the gesso, which probably reinforced some kind of traced element from a cartoon, and then was elaborated in a more free manner, freehand with different drawing materials. Again, we'll see more about that later. But this is a technique that's very characteristic of Leonardo for developing his first transferred design that you can also see in unfinished works. I mean, he left us some wonderful cutaway views of his technique by not finishing things in the Leonardo, in the St. Jerome. And that's a figure whose pose with the arm out actually links a bit to one of the ideas for the unfinished underdrawn Virgin in our work. The St. Jerome used to be dated to the 1480s, but its links to this first hidden composition on our picture suggest that it too belongs in the 1490s, which I think is reasonably established now. But because our painting has even stronger associations with other works absolutely known to be painted in Milan, such as this portrait of Cecilia Galvani, and of course this one you've all seen and heard of, The Last Supper. So if you look at the underdrawing of our painting, you can see this left hand, and the abandoned composition is very similar to the reversed image of Cecilia's right hand, and the Virgin's head. If you flip it and make it larger, it sits very nicely over a design of St. Philip from the Last Supper, and both of these seem to derive from this sketch now at Windsor. So these discoveries were huge news at the time they were made, and they removed all reasonable doubt about what our painting was, when it was, how it fitted with the Louvre painting, and how it sat comfortably in Milan in the 1490s. But incredibly much more was to come in the last year or so. Here is a campaign, an illustration of some of the new imaging techniques that my scientific colleagues we're able to use. That is hyperspectral imaging, which is extracting reflectance information across a whole range of spectra and being able to look at them in isolation. XRF scanning, where you look at different elements that are associated with pigments and plot them rather like an X-ray, but with more specificity about different pigments. And I think the real advancement has to do with their ability to process these images and find new information by combining the different techniques and doing a lot of mathematical work that I couldn't begin to understand, which results in some miraculous images. So, I mean, that really is the subject of another lecture from my scientific colleagues. I'm sorry that today I'll just have to limit myself to showing you some of the images they've created. So that's the change in what we're able to glean from the underdrawing between the technology available 10, 15 years ago and today. So you can see through a variety of techniques. This is a composite image extracting information from different kinds of XRF and infrared hyperspectral images and doing quite a lot of work post-processing to extract that information. But you see we've learned a great deal more about the pose of the Virgin and the existence of a Christ child and a supporting angel in a pose hitherto unknown and not linked to any other work that we're aware of. And I think some of the links then we were able to discuss before, say to the Philip from the Last Supper, you can see again, we could flesh that initial infrared discovery out with a much more thorough image, and you can see the link much more clearly, as well as something like the links to the St. Jerome. It's very exciting, I think, to see it much more fully than we could before. And here is another variant. There are different phases in this abandoned composition, and I think the new imaging technology, by being able to identify different materials, can sometimes give you ideas about different phases in the drawing, and you can see different ideas he was working out even within that first composition. So here with the arms crossed, it's very similar to the picture in the Met, unlike with the arm extended like the Jerome, but it's all sort of ideas percolating around in the 1490s. So the study of the underdrawing has really helped us sharpen our ideas about the dating of the picture, but it raises important questions about how the studio worked. He's clearly using, recycling, rescaling whole or partial cartoons, and that gives you a picture of a very, very busy workshop. And I think it leads to very important questions about how collaboration and delegation worked in the execution of a painting like the Virgin of the Rocks. I mean, a collaboration is explicitly described in the painting's initial contract, although there's some discussion about what that really meant. But the question of how collaboration and delegation worked within the studio is a really key question when you think about these paintings and many of the paintings produced in Milan by Leonardo and his associates. Now, this may or may not show very well in this lighting. I hope it does. Here's a sequence showing you the cleaning from 2008. And I hope you get from this, it's not really dramatic shifts in color, but it's the saturation of the darker tones. So I'll just run through a few. I may have to go back and forth. But you can see here already a cleaning has started up here. So look how dark that is relative to that. And if I just move along, see the difference in, say, this area if I go back and forth. See, that's all about the saturation of the varnish. Of course, look, the sky is much less yellow. It's certainly less yellow, but I think the big thing, if I move around, you'll see the changes sort of clockwise. There's the Baptist sort of partially cleaned in the top, less so on the bottom. Keep going around. Now you can really see with Christ essentially still uncleaned relative to the flesh tones of these two. You can get a sense of the degree of yellowing. But I think also keep an eye on the sculptural qualities of this area with and without foggy varnish. You see how that's enhanced. And the last slide, I'll get to that later, as showing you some of the few areas of significant damage in the picture. So yeah, that was the point of the cleaning. It was to thin the varnish. Here's an ultraviolet taken during cleaning, and you get an idea. This very thick, bluish-green, opaque film is the varnish before cleaning, and this is after. And you see there's a sort of thin skim still on the painting. In other words, the idea about cleaning this picture was to take off the varnish we wanted to reduce or remove to get the result we wanted. It wasn't necessarily about saying we got it all off. It's not, that kind of cleaning. Now, just talking a little bit about the retouching. A lot of Roman's retouchings were above his varnish, which had just degraded, so they had to come off. But he had some base reconstructions, blocking in of color, that in losses that was perfectly good, perfectly stable. So here we left those and used them again for the modified glaze. So this is the loss, you see. And here is, after my cleaning, that's Roman's restoration underpaint, which I used and happily reworked for the final image. We did quite a bit of that, not in every case, but in some cases. So now I just want to move a little bit about how the painting itself was developed and made. So here's a cross-section just giving you an idea of the build-up. So we have a conventional preparation with gesso, with a warm gray imprimatura and 2 layers. The lower layer is mostly lead and lead white, carbon black, and the upper layer is a bit more yellow, had some lead tin yellow. The binding medium was identified at the time as being untreated walnut oil. The imprimatur was extensively smoothed and probably patted with the hand, since fingerprints and palm prints are visible in the X-radiograph. You can see these with the naked eye in some places, but they don't seem to be in the main paint layers, restricted to the priming. And that's something Vasari talks about, putting the priming on 50, 60 years later. So that fluid underdrawing of the initial abandoned composition was executed straight on the gesso. And quite a few cross-sections show a thin layer with carbon black and a brown kind of medium below the imprimatura. And subsequent drawing layers are seen in cross-section above the imprimatura as an upper sample from the yellow lining of the Virgin's mantle. And you can find some between the 2 applications. This sounds pretty abstract, but maybe you can see some of it in these close-up photographs from Christ's nearer arm. And you can see this thin yellow layer just passing over some of the clear drawing lines of this second composition. So the question of how the drawing gets elaborated from the first cartoon, both above and below priming layers, is particularly complicated in this case because of the abandoned composition. The second imprimatur, which we see in cross-section, was probably applied well after that first layer to reduce the presence of the composition he was leaving behind. Anyway, the recent imaging work has done a great deal to unpick the different drawing materials within different phases of the work. Anyway, it's difficult to make a clear demarcation. There's not a moment when drawing stops and painting begins in most of Leonardo's works, because the drawing gets developed very gradually into a tonal, almost monochromatic, translucent, brown kind of underpainting with some local color, but it's a kind of brownish sepia sort of thing. And that's one of the more notable aspects of how he painted at this time anyway, certainly through the 1490s. So, I mean, the most famous example of this fluid wash-like underpainting is the unfinished Adoration of the Magi, which, just for fun, I show you before its recent treatment, and here's the detail now. You can really understand it in all its glory. It's a miraculous restoration done in Florence about 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, our old friend, the St. Jerome, which shows all these phases. You can see first drawing with an imprimatur over, some modification of the drawing on top, the blocking in color and the rest of it. Almost every phase of his work you can see in different parts of that painting. Now, parts of the National Gallery painting never went much beyond this stage. For example, here, the vegetation and rocks above the Baptist. In this part of the composition, you can see, and many cross-sections as well, this brown, kind of consistent browny yellow underpaint. Here you can see a cross-section from here, underneath the Baptist foot. There's that browny wash, which in fact is what you're seeing here, extending underneath. It's kind of everywhere. Here it is again, under the Virgin's mantle. In other words, a systematic underpainting of the whole work with less bright colors to give it a kind of tonal unity. And I think that's a key element of what makes the work so striking, and the fact that it has this consistent undermodeling and then color added on top. But there's a kind of cohesiveness and an orchestration of effect that is only achieved through doing that, that is very much a signature kind of quality of Leonardo. We looked at the paint medium when we were doing part of the restoration 10, 15 years ago, because that hadn't really been examined very much apart from our colleagues in Munich who did quite a lot of work. I mean, the Derner Institute proposed some very intriguing explanations for drawing problems and ultramarine degradation. We certainly have that in our work. Here's some detail of the Virgin of the Rocks showing the kind of severe wrinkling, cracking, and shrinkage, which is usually associated with poor drying. My scientific colleagues confirmed that virtually everything, there being premature layers and the majority of the upper paint were applied in walnut oil, but the grey underpaint of the tunic and mauve-brown underpaint of the drapery were probably done in linseed oil. Anyway, the whole point is that the materials are quite conventional for Italian painting of the period, and the paint defects we see are probably more the result of overly thick applications, inadequate drying times between layers, particularly when you have pigments that don't dry very well, like ultramarine, brown, and black. It's that rather than some experimental kind of alchemical new binding medium, tempting as it is to give that to Leonardo. And I think it's important to realize that the kind of things he was interested in exploring really was the differences between very dark passages, the effect of the way that the lack of light kind of corrodes our ability to see color. Those required him to work extensively, ironically, with precisely the pigments that are the least good at drying in oil paint. So it's an unfortunate circumstance, but that's why this is not at all unusual for works by Leonardo, that the dark passages often look like that. The deterioration of the ultramarine mantle of the Virgin is quite disturbing because it's in the most richly colored part of the whole painting. And the surface glazes of natural ultramarine are applied over a relatively unchanged layer of azurite, are very rough textured and broken up, and there's a kind of irretrievable loss of color in the pigment itself. I think the most serious problem of interpretation in these parts is the partial loss of modeling in the folds of the fabric. And now they appear a bit flat and formless. And the new imaging work that my scientific colleagues made has been able to show more of the intended dramatic modeling of the folds as laid out in the underpaint, but this has been lost irretrievably, I'm afraid, in the upper layers. Now just a little excursion into some pigments. There's a red lake pigment used in parts of the painting which should be mentioned. In the Virgin's tunic, it was applied in a mixture with some lead white and a little charcoal. It's hard to see, and it is rather broken up, but here you can see some of it in this paint layer, and you see blotches of slightly purpley paint. And a similar mixture was used in the Angel's blue drapery, which in the mauvey underlayer. These parts of the painting suffered more damage than elsewhere, and after removal of some of Ruhrmann's retouchings, the underlayer was exposed in several large paint losses. Now, this is going to be a bit technical, bear with me. Cross-sections from both areas of the painting show these characteristic rounded translucent particles. You see them there, which show very strong fluorescence in UV. And we did something called ATR, FTIR, well, my scientific colleagues did. Anyway, the point is that it was identified, these particles, as containing starch. And they did that by comparing the spectra from the pigment and the standard. And so it's possible that the damage that occurred where this pigment is used is related to the presence of starch, which seems to be part of the manufacture of the lake and made it inherently vulnerable. It certainly is striking that the only parts of the picture that really have substantial losses of color, that is the top layer of the Virgin's tunic and the underlayer of the angel, are those with high concentrations of this starchy red lake. And it was the earliest example that had been known of this starch identified in a red lake paint. Anyway, going back to the composition, it's immediately obvious the gallery painting is not just a simple reprise of the Louvre version. You can see the pose, gesture, draperies of the angel are substantially different, for example, between here and here. The color, the pose, the gaze, all sorts of things. The London picture has gilded halos for all the figures apart from the angel, and the infant Baptist has his cross in a slight relief of applied gilded tin. And these features are absent from the Paris version. And it's interesting, if you see in the exhibition, they might appear, I always thought they appear a bit strident, these elements of gilding, but of course when you think of them in the context of a huge kind of machine of gilded sculpture and relief, they actually form linkages and seem entirely appropriate and actually rather restrained. Leonardo seemed, I think we can say, uninterested in just repeating himself. And the study we've made of the picture shows more and more about these characteristic pattern of changes he made as he worked on the second version. As our colleagues in the Louvre noticed a long time ago, the head of Christ was initially based on this cartoon fragment, now given to the studio of Leonardo rather than himself by the Louvre, but still obviously the basis for this head. And if you look at our painting in X radiography, and again this is something that's come out even more clearly in recent imaging work, but you see the X-ray of our Christ child has got another head underneath, and if you do a bit of flipping and moving around, you can see it aligns perfectly well with that. So he would have been painted first and taken to some pretty advanced stage, I think, in this pose, and then changed to the profile we see now, which is itself the basis of this, based on this red chalk study, which is thought to have been some years later. So again, he's working on this and changing his ideas well after the painting, even the second composition had started. So research published by the Louvre shortly after our treatment, back in 2010, suggests the relationship of the two works was much closer than we'd thought. And here's just a rough idea of superimposing the two images, one red, one green, probably in large part based on using the same basic cartoon or cartoons as a starting point. I mean, rather weirdly, the National Gallery painting retains some of the earlier features, like the way the angel's arms are posed, which were changed during the execution of the earlier painting. So this angel started out with arm down and then was changed to having it posed, and so the pointing rather, and so the second version actually reverts to that older idea after trying the new ideas underneath. I know it's very confusing, but but anyway, within this kind of context, the manipulation and recycling of all these elements like heads and arms and things seems entirely in keeping with his general approach to reusing and adapting compositional ideas. The idea you have that same hand in Cecilia Gallerani, The Last Supper, a Virgin. It appears in a great Boltraffio altarpiece in Berlin. If an idea is good, it's worth using. So some cross-sections give further indications of the sequence of revisions that seems to have accompanied him working on this painting. And it's so discontinuous. I was tempting to think he came back in 1506 and thought, no, I wanted to make some big changes, because there are quite a few major alterations rather late in the day. There's this big change in the proper left contour of her shoulder and mantle, which you can actually see with the naked eye. You can see the brown underneath, and you can see the blue underneath. And it's very clear in the cross-section as well, where the brown paints come over the blue here, and you can see it with the macro photograph peeking through, so the mantle was further out. This is a part of a larger pattern of changes within the mantle, which have been much better understood through the recent campaign of XRF work that the scientific department did. But this adjustment was first blocked in using a brown paint, very similar to that which we found in a revision of near the Baptist lower foot, and part of the Virgin's robe. And this is very interesting because, oops, what have I done? This bit of brown is just sort of troweled on over completed blue drapery, and one assumes that there was an intention to do something more with that. You can see the blue underneath the brown, so the brown on top of the finished drape and the foot, but never really got resolved. His second foot is scarcely, this is that kind of St. Jerome. It's just sketched in very, very loosely on the imprimatur. First highlight coming in, but like the backhand supporting Christ is basically not taken much beyond the initial drawing stage. And I think there are inconsistencies like that throughout the whole picture, which is such a variation in completion, and it does make you wonder how much of that was a quite deliberate artistic intent and how much of it was down to the circumstances of stopping and starting and being in situ and the rest of it that happened over the long 25-year evolution of the composition. I mean, here's another really interesting example that this final application of ultramarine in the sky in the upper right is really just kind of squidged in and no transitions, nothing. Very different than the careful gradations here. And we know that there was shall we say, a discussion about whether the work would be paid for in 1506, being as incomplete as it was. And it does make you wonder if this isn't paint that might have been put on when the picture was in its frame as part of a final campaign to get it advanced enough I mean, there's no way of knowing that, but the circumstantial evidence is certainly interesting because also it's got a different oil as well than the paint below, so it's definitely a later phase. I mean, later in the terms of within the 25-year period of the evolution of the composition. So that's probably the easiest example of other inconsistencies. And these inconsistencies could have to do, as I said, with lack of finish or maybe collaborators or delegation. It's really hard to say. I mean, there's a whole variety of opinion about that. And I think it asks the questions, that's all, really. So I think interpretation is complicated further by the kind of visual changes we have in passages from degradation and pigment alteration, for example, the modeling of the drapery. There are cases where you can see quite interesting distinctions. I mean, in the Virgin's hair, there seem to be two campaigns of hair painting. There's this kind of rather orange and yellow, hot color, and then below you can see this very fine silvery hair. And you see something quite similar in comparing the hair between the angel and the Baptist and Christ. And we can look at, even her hands look quite different from one another. And that can be because they're painted several years apart, or maybe there's more delegation, or maybe this hand isn't as finished as it might be, or maybe it's hard to say. This is a really interesting one to me, is the slightly awkward finish of the look of Christ's foot. It's very different than this underdrawing with a large big toe and very organic looking different toes, and these are more or less all the same size. Is that studio assistance or... But then the interesting thing is that the Louvre painting, the completed Louvre painting, the analogous foot is very much like that. So it's all quite a complicated bit of evidence to interpret. I'm not sure how far we can take the interpretation. And it is worth remembering, I think, that if a certain amount of finishing work was done after it was installed in 1503, I think lighting would not have been ideal, and I think the level of finish might reflect that in the variation of color and brushwork in certain parts. Now, it seemed very clear to us that that very traditional, old-fashioned model of attribution, we should say 19th century or so, figures by Leonardo, everything else studio, that really oversimplifies the way he worked and the studio worked. And I think, whatever you feel about authorship of every detail or the intent behind all the non-finished areas, you do need to think about that. And I think that was very important in guiding our approach to the retouching. I show you an image here of the picture after cleaning, before restoration. And so it's very important in considering our retouching not to put a kind of misleading degree of finish or homogeneity on finish as a result of our efforts. And so we're very cautious about the intervention we made. So yeah, much of the 20th century discussion of our painting and its technique was really almost obsessed with the question of whether it was more or less autograph, i.e. better or worse than the one in Paris. And I think that's a preoccupation that doesn't give the right weight to thinking about how his studio worked or how elastic the idea of authorship could be. And here's where I think the most recent research has given us some very, very interesting insight about how we should think about this picture. I mean, the new investigations have even further underscored just how complicated the evolution of our panel really was, and not just in terms of how it formal composition. I mean, to me, the most exciting thing was discovery of, in that first composition, a very clear psychological interaction between the Virgin and Christ. And that's a very, very different narrative intent than both of the existing Virgin of the Rocks, where the primary interaction is between Christ and the Baptist. And I think this is something that I'm sure will stimulate a lot of art historical thinking in the future, because it has all sorts of theological implications that are too subtle for me. But the point is, it's more than just a compositional variant. It's a very different meaning. And I find that truly fascinating. And it kind of underscores our kind of assumption that he doesn't just repeat himself and to think, oh, I'll try an arm in a different place. It's a deeper engagement than that. And I think the idea that we have now of such a complicated evolution of our panel, that seemed very unusual 10 or 15 years ago, and it seems much less so now due to the work of our colleagues in other museums looking at other works. I think there's a broader context of other confirmed examples of Leonardo making huge changes during the course of painting, and also how he shared evolving compositions with his associates and his collaborators as his work progressed. I think his workshop was particularly porous, and I think that could have to do with the fact that when he went to Milan, he had to build a workshop to take on huge projects very quickly, and so it was an unusual mix of people that he kind of trained himself and fully formed painters he brought in and inculcated the house style, as it were, or tried to. But I think that made for an unusual kind of blend of abilities and interests. Martin Kemp has talked about this famous composition of the yarn winder, which there are I don't know how many variations. He described the composition as something that leaked from the studio. And it's interesting to see how recent studies show how many versions of lesser quality contain compositional features. There's a baby walker in the background that were covered up in the superior versions, which just shows that the composition was out there and being used by associates even before the painting was done. That's actually described in a contemporary text. But this aspect of his practice was developed when the Louvre had their exhibition dedicated to the Saint-Anne a few years ago, and they showed how copies and variants made sort of during real time reflected the evolution of the picture itself. And I think the most dramatic example came from the Prado's research and reappraisal of their Leonardo studio Mona Lisa, and because it seems to, their technical research showed that it more or less tracked changes of the Mona Lisa itself during a period of the Mona Lisa's evolution, and then only part of it. But you can see similar, that just shows that they were, for a time, evolving side by side. So when you get back to our picture, I think the process of dissemination that I've just shown you can be seen even in our abandoned composition. So a few years ago, this picture turned up in the art market. It's a contemporary Milanese painting, but it has a fascinating echo in paint, I think, of some of the ideas of the abandoned composition. A composition which had been thought to have very little wider influence. So there it was, somebody had seen something around it and used it as a basis of another idea. And it gives another example of dissemination of works still in progress, made many years after our painting. The composition on the Virgin of the Rocks panel had been covered over. And as I said before, in Paris, their work on the Virgin of the Rocks provided another important shift in how we understand our painting almost immediately after we finished our study 10 years ago. So anyway, the point is that our painting sits now more happily in a wider and understood wider habit of Leonardo reusing, adjusting, and sharing ideas that have been established in so many works. And I think this is really fascinating, and yet I know that for many the attribution question still looms largest where the painting is concerned and around the whole business of collaboration. I've written before about my field. You find Leonardo in the close examination of the best details, but most importantly, actually, the whole messy creative process itself, the abandoned compositions, the modifications, the delays, the reluctance to finish, and that itself is a kind of carrier of a very chaotic authenticity. And I think writing some 40-odd years ago, John Shearman, eminent art historian, described also the careful orchestration of our paintings, tonal and chromatic relationships, and I think that's the key to understanding its qualities. He described huge advances from the Paris painting, which are the consequences of Leonardo thinking and studying light and vision, which you can track in his writings at the time. I think that systematic exploitation of the Brownie tonal undermodeling we talked about has allowed Leonardo to simulate how our vision fails to perceive color effectively in darker tones. And it gives you a kind of understated unity across the whole painting that is a big shift from the more kind of traditional Quattrocento balancing act of putting strong colors evenly against one another, the red, blue, and yellow, the primary triad, all that sort of thing. I think it's the combination of that overall sophistication and orchestration and the puzzling kind of variations in local application that is central to how we think about quality and authorship. It's been suggested that more than one of Leonardo's yarn winders would have been understood by contemporaries as by the hand of Leonardo, which is one way of thinking about the problem. This can be contrasted with other tendencies to unpick the handwriting of each passage of paint in isolation and search of precise attributions. And so I don't know what kind of consensus exists about what authorship really means in such a context. I mean, as a restorer, as a conservator, we stare at paintings for hundreds of hours, and we're usually pretty good at looking at detailed stylistic comparisons, and we usually have a good sense of how you can use technical analysis, the implications of technical analysis. But I think there's much more to these questions than these elements, and there are much wider considerations which require you to think about a broader kind of cultural context. I think looking across the field, recent research has shown change, collaboration, dissemination to be very common in Leonardo's workshop, which has important implications for how we understand any one work, including ours. But I think there's a great deal more still to discuss, and I know that we're not finished, even though I am. Thank you very much.